Okay, welcome everybody to this afternoon's March the 24th Committee of the Whole meeting. We always acknowledge the fact that this meeting is being held in the traditional territory of our friends, our neighbors, and our Treaty 8 partners at Fort Nelson First Nation, as well as at the Prophet River First Nation. We recognize the treaty, we recognize the rights within that treaty, and we recognize the enduring presence of the Métis people who have been in our region for a long time. So please be advised that this afternoon's meeting is available to the public to attend virtually, is being streamed and recorded. Are there any additions to the agenda, Council? Staff? Thank you. Are there any members of the public who would like to address the Committee of the Whole meeting? Anything on today's agenda? Anybody online? Anybody in the room? Yeah, good. Everybody's okay with the agenda the way it is? Okay. Okay, that brings us straight to agenda item 5.1. The Ministry of Water, Lands and Resource Stewardship going to talk to us today about the boreal caribou update. If you all remember, we sent a letter last year. I forget the date. And so the wildlife ecologist, Scott Childs, is that the way you say your name, Scott? Childs?
Shields.
Shields. Oh, okay. I think there's missing an E here, but okay. Well, thank you very much for coming today. Certainly appreciate you responding and letting us know what's happening with boreal caribou. So I'll turn the floor over to you, and the time is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. I will try to share my screen quickly here. And I believe I will be joined today by my colleague Tyler Muley, who is the manager of the habitat initiatives for our region. But I don't see him on here yet, so potentially just issues with Zoom. Can get confirmation. Can everybody see the screen?
Yes, we can see it.
All right. Thank you very much. So as per the introduction, I'm Scott Shields. I'm a section head with the Caribou Recovery Program based out of Dawson Creek, BC, which is where I'm calling you from today. And we're here to talk about some proposed wildlife habitat areas for boreal caribou within the Fort Nelson and Fort St. John timber supply areas. As was mentioned in the preamble, we sent out a consultation notice on this back in I think July, maybe early August of 2024. And the regional municipality did send a response letter in, I believe, early September. There's been a little bit of back and forth, lots of pauses due to the election in between there. And we're here to hopefully respond to some of the questions that have remained unanswered in that time. So a little bit of a refresher of the scope here. These orders and protection measures that we're here to talk about today were identified in the Boreal Caribou Protection and Recovery Plan, which was initially sent out for public engagement in 2022-2023 and received cabinet endorsement in summer of 2023. So the scope of this plan is the 4 northern boreal caribou herds shown here in kind of beige, Max Hamish, Callander, Snake Saturday, and Westside Fort Nelson. And the direction that we received from cabinet was to proceed with protection measures over the most critical core habitat areas and to defer other management actions into the ongoing land use planning processes, in this case, the Liard Water and Land Stewardship Forum. So I think almost everybody's very familiar with this background. We've been talking about this plan for a while now, but I just did want to emphasize that we're only talking about these critical interim orders at the moment. Everything else that's outlined in the plan in terms of habitat protections or updates to best management practices or access routes, that's all been deferred to that land use planning process so that it can be a more fulsome discussion with industry, local governments, and other stakeholders. So the orders themselves are shown here in green. These are wildlife habitat areas under the Forest and Range Practices Act. So in total, all of these areas cover about 2.4 million hectares. When you remove the other areas that are like already existing protections on the ground, this will be about 1.6 million hectares of net new protection being established, predominantly in the Fort Nelson TSA. There is a small inclusion in the Fort St. John TSA because these plans were built based on where the caribou are, not exactly where our administrative barriers are. So these are divided into 8 different order areas. A little bit tough to see on this map with the outlines in black. The order language and intent is identical across all of these areas. The reason that they're divided is for administrative flexibility. So upfront, that allows the decision maker to institute some, but not all of these areas. And more importantly, down the line, if we want to make revisions to either the extent of the areas or their intent as a result of, say, the land use planning process, it's a lot easier to change just one area rather than having to do all 8 at once within an order. But again, to stress, the intention for all of these is exactly the same. So what are those intentions, Scott? These would be considered no harvest areas. Again, these only apply to the Forest and Range Practices Act. So this would provide restrictions on forestry harvest and road building more than anything else. And again, specifically road building under the Forest and Range Practices Act. Activities such as habitat restoration and wildlife enhancement are allowed without exemption. So there should be the intention is that there's no interruption to those types of activities. And then other things such as wildfire salvage harvest or sanitation for the purposes of pest control would require an exemption to proceed in these areas, just to check that they're aligned with the intention of the order. The intention of the order is to protect and promote caribou habitat. So wildfire salvage activities or basically any other forest activity that is in service of that goal should be allowed following the exemption process. Notably, this won't impact any 10 years or permits already issued under the Forest and Range Practices Act. So where there are existing roads, those are grandfathered in and remain unaffected.
Scott,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a question there?
Yes.
So you talked about exemptions around the habitat. Did that include wildfire mitigation? So fuel mitigation for wildfire, would that be included in the exemption that you have to apply for?
That is noted. So any sort of wildfire risk reduction activity is noted as an acceptable activity. So it would not require an exemption. It can go ahead. There's a guidance document around what that means. Just because, you know, not all these things are particularly well defined, but what we commonly see up in Fort Nelson is a lot of that reduction in fuel loading, and that would be permitted, yes.
Okay, yeah, because there's a piece down the dump road. I know that our Fire Smart committee is looking at a piece down to the south end of our dump road that is in the caribou protection area. So I'm just wondering, it sounds like that, you know, providing to get all the proper permits and stuff, that this won't be a hindrance to that.
Correct. That is the intention. There's always, as I think we all know, things can hit hiccups going through these processes and get flagged at when they aren't supposed to. So we always recommend that to start the conversation early. But I can again reiterate, the intention is to not stop those things. We want to reduce wildfire risk in these areas.
Good, thank you.
So within our analysis, we're not expecting any impacts to other tenure holders under other acts. So for instance, mineral tenures, gravel pits, those sorts of things, that doesn't normally fall under the Forest and Range Practices Act. And this should not impact any PNG or oil and gas exploration. I do make the note, however, that the BC Energy Regulator is advancing these same sorts of interim measures to put a pause on surface tenuring within some of these areas at the same time. again, just to align with ongoing land use planning processes. But those aren't legal orders. That's just more of a heightened review, pause on works. As part of their engagement and consultation, which I've been a part of some of, we have been working with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers and a lot of the local tenure holders to ensure there's no impact to their services. Really, wherever there exists subsurface tenure for oil and gas resources, the intention is to make sure that there's still the ability to access those. Next slide, maybe. Yes. So there is anticipated impact to the available fiber supply as a result of these orders. So it's an estimated impact of around 400,000 cubic meters per year under the annual allowable cut within the Fort Nelson TSA, and then a smaller, I don't think there's any small impacts, of 60,000 meters cubed within the Fort St. John TSA. Also of note, following the initial consultation on these plans back in 2023, we did make spatial amendments to remove any overlap with the community forest agreement and ensure that there's no impact to access in there. And I will note that these are estimates only. The Office of the Chief Forester is the only one that can set the annual allowable cut through timber supply review, but based on the current information that we have working with the Forest Analysis and Inventory branch, this is sort of the estimated impact that would be coming in. In terms of consultation and engagement, as I said, this has been a bit of a strange process because we had an election right in the middle of it, which really paused communication for a couple of months. But consultation was engaged or initiated in July of 2024. Every nation with overlapping territory received a consultation package internally to the other government agencies, of course, range tenure holders, trapline holders, guide outfitters, and local governments such as yourselves. And of particular note, we did consult with all forest licensees in the Northeast, so not necessarily even only those that have tenure here. There's a list there, but definitely includes Peak and Fort Nelson First Nation Forestry Partnership, who have been involved, I would say, since before this consultation began, but throughout the entire planning process, we've been sharing these areas and their intentions. So that consultation period is wrapping up, and we're getting ready to move towards decision on that front. So a lot of my remaining slides are on wildfire impacts to caribou, because I know that was a particular question point for this group. So I'll pause here if we want to go back or review any pieces of this particular process or these orders.
Thanks for that. There's a few members of the public that are clamoring to ask some questions, and this part of the meeting is not open for questions to the general public. But I'm just wondering if there is a public question period at the end, if you're prepared to answer a few questions from the public towards the end.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. And we also, I can provide, well, I actually have my contact information is at the end of this slide deck. And we do have like a general inquiries email inbox for those that we maybe don't get to or answer fully today.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So I don't see any questions from council with respect to what you've covered so far.
Okay. So looking briefly at wildfire impacts, one thing that was noted is that the plans, the areas, everything were drawn up and consulted on in 2023, or by winter 2023, and then that summer and the following summer there was, of course, massive wildfire impacts. So a question is, are these still appropriate areas to choose for caribou, and how have they been reacting to it? So I'll do a really brief overview of that right now, and then we're always happy to come back with more fulsome overviews of caribou status updates and how they're doing. But in short, how we gather a lot of this information is via our radio collars and aerial surveys. So every year we put GPS collars on a target of 150 female caribou within all of the boreal caribou ranges. So that does include Chinchaga further to the south. And then we monitor that for survival. Both survival and mortality. And then we have annual aerial surveys that look at calf survival over the past year. Every time we're doing a collaring project or there is a mortality and we're investigating the cause of that mortality, we're gathering health data on parasites, minerals, hormones, body status, fat composition, whatever is available to us. Sometimes when you come to these mortality sites, you're just looking at bones that's left, but wherever we can, we're gathering quite a few samples. And that translates into our monitoring kind of on an annual basis to look at the overall status, but really also kind of day to day. And the recent fires offer a really interesting study opportunity to see how caribou react to such a large spread fire impact within a short period of time. So as a little example of how we're keeping track of that in the short term, here's all of the GPS telemetry points from one individual caribou over the span of 1 month in the Parker Lake fire area. So this is from when the fire was first initiated to the end of what we call the calving season to see where the movements are. And as you can see, while the caribou did spend some time within the fire perimeter, probably when it wasn't actively on fire, and then quickly exited out and made its way back towards starting point, but we're not seeing a huge shift of a caribou moving, 10, 20, 30 kilometers away from a fire perimeter. But we're also not seeing them hang out directly right in front of the fire or coming back in. So this is an example of one caribou, and we took all of this data over I believe that year we had 120 collars out, so 120 individuals, and created these heat maps of caribou use based on all the telemetry locations. So for that, I'm going to be focusing in on the very northeast corner of the province, just because that's where we had the kind of the most intensive fire impacts that year. And you'll see these blobs are the most heavily used areas from caribou of each herd. So you see some overlaps where, this southern herd overlaps with the northern herd. And this is in 2023 or 2022 prior to the large scale fires. And then the summer of 2023, this is the fire perimeters that you see hit pretty much the entirety of that range. This mapping doesn't have the fire severity on it because there was a lot of fires in kind of bog fen areas. We know that the intensity of that was quite variable. So this is, again, looking at where they hung out in 2022, where all the fires were in 2023. And then the next map here is showing where they're hanging out in the summer of 2024, so 1 year post fires. And this was actually a surprising result that, not only did we not see the range abandonment of them moving quite far away from the fire perimeter, but the summer following the fire impacts, they were coming back into those freshly burned areas at close to the same rate that they were in the years previous. This is 1-2 years after the effect. I don't want to speculate too much on what this will look like, 5-10 years down the line. But it has been quite interesting to see that there's still a lot of site fidelity to go back to the same places that they've used for years and years previously. And anecdotally, because we are flying over these areas quite a bit, we're seeing a lot of caribou use those kind of less burned patches within the heavily burned fire areas. So the speculation is that this is a great source of summer forage for them, and there's not a lot of predation pressure in areas where there has been recent burns. We're already partnering with researchers that have been brought on by Fort Nelson First Nation, as well as the University of Calgary on this continued monitoring effort. Because as I said, the research community is really excited about this because boreal caribou in BC are some of probably the best monitored within the country. And now that we've had this massive impact, we have 10 years of pre-data and several years of post-data to continue monitoring these effects. And the hope is that we can be reactive and continue to change these, what we're doing on the landscape in terms of protection or extraction as new information comes in. Forgot I had these charts in, but this is a quick chart here that shows the probability of caribou being located within a burn perimeter based on the number of days since the fire started. So as you see that first fire season in the summer, there's basically a 0% chance they're moving outside of the actual fire perimeter. And then that following summer, we see it around day 200. So I guess the spring, it comes back up to basically what it was pre-fire, which is, I like to be honest, I spent a lot of time researching caribou and looking at them. We were surprised that the effect was this strong, or they've been coming back this frequently. And then in terms of overall survival and how they're hanging out, I include this chart, which has on the side here the growth rate every year of all the boreal caribou herds based on our monitoring data, just to kind of demonstrate that it is highly variable. And we always say don't focus too much on any one year, be that positive or negative. These are best looked at over a long-term trajectory. Because all of these growth rates come out to about negative 1% growth over the past 20 years. But as you see, there's some dramatic swings within there. But I did want to highlight with this, in 2023, across all these ranges, we did see a bit of a drop off in the growth rate, higher mortality rates. But in 2024, which was also a large fire year, a bit of a bounce back or positive growth rates. So again, it's not to speculate on how the overall herds are doing, but just that we haven't seen large scale range abandonment, and we haven't seen a huge drop off in caribou numbers. And both of those are good news stories, but we're going to continue monitoring it because we don't always see instantaneous effects out of these. And I believe that's all I had. I know I was supposed to take 20 minutes. We're already at 22. I have contact information here and happy to take any questions now or head back in the presentation as needed.
Okay, Scott, thank you very much for that. You did answer a couple of questions for sure that we had put out there, particularly around, whether or not these orders are still pertinent in an area that's been ravaged by fire, I suppose, and what the habitat looks like and whether or not we saw loss of numbers. So, your initial findings, I guess, over the last couple of years are encouraging for sure with respect to the fact that the caribou are still hanging there. It'd be interesting to see, over the next few years, whether we see an increase in the population or not, and whether or not we see more forage out there because of these burns. Mm-hmm. I know there was a small herd on my trap line, which is right at the north end of Cacho Lake, in the south end of the Calendar herd. It was 7 when I first bought that trap line. It got up to 10. And I saw 7 last weekend rummaging around in a burn area. There wasn't a lick of green anywhere, but they were wandering around there. So I guess it'll be interesting to see if they survive. There was no wolves tracks that I could see in that area. So, from being on the ground up there, everything you've said seems to reflect what I saw out there as well. So thank you for the presentation. Does anybody from council have any questions? I'm just wondering if I missed, because I got on the phone there to send a message to Jim Fulton, who's looking to ask a question. And I think you might have said it though, have those orders for those high value protection areas actually gone through, or are you still contemplating those orders? I know the ones. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, these are those orders.
Yeah.
What were proposed here today, and no, they are not enacted as of right now. They're still proposed.
Right, and so the other ones, they'll go into the land use planning, but these are the ones that you're talking about, and we're just. So, is there any idea what the timeline is on that?
It's not up to me, is what I say first. But
Yep.
We expect it relatively soon. In all conversations, this is a multi-party initiative, both within BC government, because this includes my ministry as well as Ministry of Forests and Energy Carbon Solutions, and then the BC Energy Regulator. But we're targeting for everything to be one team announcement, and it's spring 2025, so right around now. As I said, we had a weird consultation period because of the election, but those decision packages in my mind are prepared, ready to go, where they're under legal review, everything else. And now it's up to people with bigger paychecks to make sure that they're complete and that we've done everything needed. But that's the main answer, is that hopefully for me, in short order, these will be enacted.
And are they enacted by cabinet or a statutory decision maker?
The statutory decision maker.
All right, so they can be done in isolation of the cabinet then. Okay, or the ministers, essentially.
Yes.
Okay, I think the last question I had, and I thought I saw it somewhere, but I'd just like you to read it into the record if you would, is the impact to the annual allowable cut that you're aware of.
Yes, we have modeled an impact to the annual allowable cut of 405,000 cubic meters per year as a result of these orders. I know I don't want to speak to timelines necessarily, but I know that with the land use planning ongoing, that the Office of the Chief Forester is planning to do timber supply reviews across the Northeast within the next couple of years, and that's when we would see the official updates come into play. But our modeled impact is 405,000 cubic meters per year.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I was more concerned over the impact of the fires, but they clearly outlined it, and no more questions for me.
Okay. Councillor Souls, anything? I know you've been really active on this file, and that's why I'm just interested in your thoughts.
My thoughts are that this process overall has a lot of merit in it. I find it interesting to note that the traditional ranges of the caribou are largely, not completely, but largely overlaid by fire, or a blend of fire, as you mentioned, where there's some fire, but there's some remaining green areas. And so I think that we're in a position provincially needing to do timber supply reviews and so on, regardless of this, the caribou supply, just simply the fires themselves. From a harvesting point of view, they are also impacting the annual cut and so on. So I see, though, that one of the things that I recommend, I see this moving ahead as a good thing to provide us with some definition as to what we can and can't do, rather than, or where we can and can't do, rather than an ambiguous boogeyman caribou survival idea behind the scenes that doesn't give us any definition. I think it's also, so I consider this to be overall a good order, especially given the fact that it's temporary, because it allows for the adaptations that are necessary. So it means there still will be room for input. But one of the concerns that I have has always been, and I appreciate Scott's take on that, the measurability of the herds themselves has been, that's data that we used to look for, and it was scarce or maybe not shared with us or what. But when you're flying, it's easier to see a caribou on a burn than it is to see a caribou in hiding in the bush. And maybe I'm just curious about the measurables as far as success goes. If you're going to restrict areas from forest harvesting, but still allow oil and gas exploration and so on to take place, what will be the measurables? And I kind of get that you're looking at calf survival rates and numbers, growth in numbers overall, or at very least sustaining the numbers. So just comment on the measurables, how to determine if these orders are being successful.
Absolutely. Another piece that will be key in terms of measurables here is habitat and landscape status. Because just protecting an area or saying it's not restricted doesn't instantly regrow the trees or regrow the habitat there. That does take a considerable amount of time or direct intervention by things like habitat enhancement or habitat restoration. We do have a commitment to every 5 years reviewing the state of that habitat and making adjustments to the plan as needed. That's typically done, or in the past was done by large data sets of how much new disturbance or roads or whatever else has gone in over that period versus what has nominally aged out. Due to the recency of a lot of these disturbances, we're not seeing a lot of them aging out or becoming full grown yet. But one thing that BC is doing is we're flying this entire area and within 6 years, the entire province with really high quality, high density LiDAR data, which we're hoping to use to help that baseline of how has the habitat recovered up and what can we expect. So you can then couple that with this GPS monitoring data. Where do the caribou hang out over the course of the year? What are the attributes of that area? And then of course, the key indicator, as mentioned, is the health data. What are the number returns that we're seeing? What's the rate of predation? What is the calf survival? And all those health metrics that we're receiving. Another thing that has been going on in the boreal caribou ranges over the last 5 years now is fecal DNA surveys, where we fly in the winter and collect buckets and buckets of poop, and then send that off to universities for analysis of overall herd health. And using genetic markers, we can say, relative herd size, how much interplay there is between the different herds, here and heading into other jurisdictions, like up into the territories or across into Alberta. So kind of all these things combined, our goal is to recover caribou populations to self-sustaining. We know that there's been a long-term decline now. So that year-over-year data has to take into account all of the habitat metrics that we're seeing, but ultimately are we being successful in growing caribou populations? And can never answer that in 1 year, but I think we have the tools to do so over the long term.
Scott, do we have a target?
Like a number target for a boreal caribou population?
when does the population become sustainable?
Well, it's an interesting definition piece. So the short answer is no. We don't have a number that says we want exactly 1,000 caribou. We have what we know this area sustained, 30 years ago, which was more than double the caribou that we're seeing now. And we know that that was already, smaller than what the nations were experiencing for generations before that. What BC is working towards is part of the federal government standards for species at risk, where we would want to grow each herd at least over 300 animals and see the stable aspect means that we're not seeing declines over any 5-year period. So they mark that as even like a 1% decline. So yeah, that's a lot of words that would know we don't have a hard target at this point of exact number of caribou. And a big portion of that reason for that is because we think there's a long way to go and we don't want to set ourselves up with a target right now that may not be achievable. So step one is stabilization and growth within the short term. We want to see those 1, 3, 5-year numbers trending in the right direction. And then you string it off of those together. And then I think we're talking about what is a target for overall population and how do we talk about harvest within that, hunting and indigenous harvest.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I guess that's got to be fluctuating to some degree, but 300 animals per herd, stable, less than 1% decline over 5 years. Those are, I guess those are measurable. Those are things that we can sort of keep track of ourselves over time with respect to asking questions. Are we there yet? How are we doing? It gives us an idea when you report to us how we're measuring up against those basic criteria.
For sure.
Okay. Lisa, would you like to come up to the table? I see you've got a report here, so I'm just wondering. if you've got anything to add before I start asking the public if they've got any questions.
Good evening, Mayor and Councilors. So yeah, the report before you is really just based off a lot of information that Scott has provided, and it's summarized in the report. I guess the piece I'll note or highlight is, as Scott noted, the decision package has been prepared for the executive director of Walrus. I did have a conversation with him last week, and he did indicate that he's in a position to make a decision, but wanted to provide Northern Rockies with this opportunity first. So yeah, and like Scott's alluded to, the decision is pretty close.
Pending.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions for Lisa? No, thank you for that report. It summarized it out really well, actually, based on what Scott has told us today. Tyler, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, nothing from me. Just thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much. So with that, then I'll open it up to the public. I know Jim's been hanging on to a question for quite a while. So Jim, if you'd like to unmute your mic and come on and ask that question, I think Scott said he'd be open to answer questions from the public.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my question is around the social economic aspect of these orders, and in particular their effect on oil and gas. You guys referred to it as P&G. So on your first slide there, it said the interim measures being advanced for P&G separately. Legal orders will align with land use planning. So I guess, A, what does that mean? And so my understanding is there was an initial order covering like 1 million hectares. And then the latest orders are an additional 1.6 million hectares or thereabouts, whatever the numbers were. Were there restrictions on oil and gas, P&G in the original orders? And then what are the restrictions, if any, in the additional new 1.6 million hectares?
Sure. Yes. So originally there is around 800,000 hectares of current protection specific to forest harvest. So those are in the form of old growth deferral areas, other wildlife habitat areas, ungulate winter ranges under this act. I believe none of those have any restrictions for oil and gas development within them. So they apply strictly to forestry. To my knowledge, there are currently no restrictions to oil and gas within this study area, apart from provincial parks and protected areas. In the past, there were some restrictions on subsurface development, subsurface tenuring, but those have since expired. So essentially a blank slate from that perspective. These new orders that I demonstrated today on their own have no implication to oil and gas, but as noted, there is parallel ones being advanced by the BC Energy Regulator. So because these are meant to be temporary in nature until a land use plan is completed, what they are advancing is called the commissioner's direction. So the commissioner is able to restrict what new tenures are given out in any particular area without the need for a legal order. And what that direction is going to be is to restrict activity to existing tenure and displacement and surface footprint. Again, it's to provide access to all the existing subsurface tenure, but hopefully really limit what is happening on the surface until we can get to a land use planning process. I know that we've worked with a lot of the license holders, the operators in this area to ensure that they will still be able to access the subsurface resource over this time frame, and we're not anticipating any issues there, but you can never anticipate all the potential issues. So that would be a short-term measure to say we're just going to put a pause on tenuring within these areas that we're already protecting for forestry in order to bring parity in that sense, and then have those enacted as a legal order through the land use planning process. So I can't, because it's not my direction, it's not my team that's putting that forward. I don't know the exact ins and outs and language of it, but that is the overall intent, is to say use the footprint and the tenure that you have right now, and we don't want to issue more. But whenever there's a case where somebody needs, say, like a little extension of a work site, or expansion of access to get into an area that they have tenure to, that should be granted, because we don't want to restrict access to the subsurface tenure. And to be, as part of the planning process on this, that's one thing that we identified. The province and everybody else is not interested in buying back tenure or like surface or subsurface. So this is part of the measures to make sure that's not the case. I hope that helps. I know it's not particularly specific, but this is the nature of these interim measures. It's more of a pause than a stop.
Thanks.
So that brings to mind for me then, so if a producer out there wanted to drill a new well, it would have to be close to existing access, because I'm suspecting they probably wouldn't get a permit to cut new access. Maybe a small lease, but definitely not a pipeline. Is that fair to say?
Potentially, yeah. And the pipelines one is one that we've really earmarked for this. Within the new oil and gas restrictions, where they're being placed, there is currently no subsurface tenure within those. So we think the odds of somebody looking to drill a well there are exceptionally low. And there was an analysis to make sure that any tenure that exists can be reached with current technology from an area outside the order. So again, that's what we're really hoping for. Pipelines and roads are something that have been flagged, and we are, as a concern of to say, yes, you'll allow me to drill my well, but when I need to export, if it goes across these type 1, type 2 areas, what's the goal? And that's something that we want to look at as a case-by-case basis. Definitely as an intention and as a principle, we want to make sure that they're able to export. But we don't want to sign a blank check saying you can put any pipeline you want across these areas. We want to make sure that it's aligning with existing access or disturbance where possible, and it's as low impact as it can be. But again, when push comes to shove, as a principle, we're making sure that you're not going to drill a well and then not be able to export it.
Right. So that'll be case by case, and that's what the exemption process is about.
Yes. And in the design, as much as possible, we try to include these sorts of export and access corridors based on where infrastructure is currently, but it's tough to model out what infrastructure will look like in 5 years. So that's, again, part of that iterative process of making sure it's reflective of the landscape.
Okay. Are there any other questions before we let Scott and Tyler go? Seeing none, Scott, Tyler, thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I think you've answered some of the questions that we've had for sure. We're all very interested in seeing how this works. Hopefully in our lifetime we'll see the Caribou come back to to numbers that are stable for sure. So did I see one more question up there? Jim, is your hand still up, or do you have another question?
No, my hand's down.
Okay, well, I see it on the screen, but thank you. Thanks for participating anyways, Jim. So thanks very much, Scott and Tyler. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Take care.
Okay, there are no new business items for this. Are there any questions from the public? Any online? No, we got that. Adjournment is in order, so we are adjourned as committee of the whole meeting. Thank you very much.